Is there a microphone? Okay. All right. I guess we will we'll get started here. Do I need to turn the lights down a little bit? Maybe. Make it nice and cozy so you can doze off, no problem. Okay. So we're gonna kind of jump back in where we were on Monday. I think there's been a little bit of shifting around, so I think there's probably a few people who are new to the class. Before I get started, though, if you have any questions about the course, about anything, something that's come up since last time, something that you're concerned about, you just want to ask, or you're new to the class and you have some questions, feel free to kind of ask them now. And then we'll kind of jump into content for today. Any questions? Something that you thought of since last time that you're worried about, or not worried, you want to know more about? I know. It's so cold, man. My office is like 18 degrees, and I'm like, so I've gone from like 2 classrooms today that I swear are like 27 degrees, and then to my frozen office, and then back here, and this actually feels pretty nice. So I'm good, but I'm like temperature shock all day long. It's a comfortable 21.8 degrees in here. All right. No questions? Everything's good with the course? I'm sure you'll have questions as we get to the assignments, but no worries if you want to ask them. Okay, well, let's jump back in then. So last time, we're just kind of setting the stage and the foundations for the idea of doing, some social research. So we're just talking about some kind of general principles having to do with kind of social research, right? And in particular, right, we're kind of looking at let me go back a little bit here, our 3 big sort of approaches, right? Are epistemologies that we can use to kind of anchor our approach into social research, right? So the first one, you can come at it from a positivist perspective, right? Where you're basically assuming that, there is an observable world that you can see, and using the kind of tools of natural science, you can make sort of objective measurements of the social world, right? Relatively value-free, right? Empiricism is the core of positivism, right? It's that you're making, you're using empirical tools of observation about the world to sort of figure out what is going on in society, right? So if you're doing social research, predicated on, this idea, so it's typically deductive, right? Most approaches that are positivistic in their nature, you start from a theory and then you collect data to try and test, your hypothesis on what you're looking at. Can be inductive as well. Generally, people who take a positivist sort of worldview or have a positivist epistemology tend to view science as, value-free because of its objectivity or intersubjectivity, as it's now sort of referred to. Okay, so that was, please, go ahead.
What does epistemology mean?
Oh, so epistemology. Well, now I have to go back even further. Epistemology, right? Epistemology is just how can we learn about the world, right? So your epistemology says what is the nature of the world? And based on what the nature of the world is, how can you get more information about it? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I almost lost my voice on Monday. This is my 4th class of the day. And so I was croaking like a frog when I got home, but Fisherman's Friend seems to have saved me. So hopefully I don't lose my voice today in the middle of class. Okay, so interpretivism, right? Different sort of school. One that is much more interested in people's experiences, right? And it has at its core an assumption of the social construction of reality, right? The idea that we can't really know the real objective nature of the world, because we're all kind of bound into a social lens, right? You're born into a society that has certain assumptions, and that we sort of construct out of the available material our own kind of versions of reality that are set in a certain time and place. Right, so basically, interpretivism has as its goal to understand the subjective kind of meaning of people's lives, right? How do people understand their own reality, their own lives? What interpretations are they making, and how does that shape the way they act in the world? Right, so yeah, it views the world from the point of view of the social actor, right? So really typical, and again, we'll touch on this again later, a lot later in the class, but really typical of, say, an interpretivist kind of way of doing research would be doing long-form interviews, right? Semi-structured, typically, interviews where you're going to ask people about their perception of the world to try and get an understanding, what we would call an empathic understanding of what the world looks like to them, right? How are they interpreting their own existence? The other thing, some other things you can do, and again, we'll go into lots of qualitative methods later on. Some people do ethnographies, right? Where you go hang out with people to try and experience the world kind of through their, like hangout. I shouldn't say hangout. That's a very academic way of putting it, where you basically embed yourself in a kind of research setting and try to experience that setting through people's eyes. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this, but that's probably going to wait till March before we get back to talking about that. Okay, good? Okay, all right. As I said, symbolic interactions and one of these big perspectives. And then the last of these long day. Big epistemologies is the critical approaches, or kind of critical theories, right? So critical theories basically critique, like interpretivism, critique positivism from a slightly different perspective. Critical perspectives tend to reject this notion that anything is value-free, right? And that even something like claims that something is scientific ultimately privilege certain kinds of knowledge while denigrating others. So someone has power, someone is oppressed in this kind of matrix, right? So if we're privileging the scientific method and scientific ways of knowing, we are, concomitantly essentially denigrating other ways of knowing, right? Things like, you could say one of the popular ones now is indigenous ways of knowing, right? That, the kind of European scientific way comes at the expense of other ways of knowing from other societies that had their own epistemologies and own ways of figuring out the world, right? So critical approaches tend to suggest that these so-called claims of something being value-free are actually some kind of play after power at the end of the day, right? To say that this is the only way you can see the world that has values embedded in it as well. And it has this sort of anti-oppressive element to it. Especially, you see this in, any kind of, critical theory or conflict theory that kind of bases itself off of a Marxist framework, right? They'll put things into the categories typically of subordinate and superordinate classes, right? So whoever has power, that's the superordinate class, and then they are subjugating those in the subordinate class. Sometimes you can, kind of freehand this into oppressor-oppressed. As kind of easier to, it's easier to say oppressor and oppressed than superordinate and subordinate, I guess. But basically, critical theories will try to break down any kind of hierarchies of power, particularly through praxis. And there is always a kind of activist or practical element to a lot of critical research and critical epistemologies that say, we're going to discover these oppressive structures and then hope to break them down. Okay, still good? Okay. All right. So, ontological consideration. So what ontology is, again, a philosophical term. Ontology is like, what do we think the nature of the world is, right? How do we, what is, I guess, ontology is the study of being, so in philosophy, if you're studying ontology, you're studying what it is to be. But in this kind of sense, it's like, what do we think the world is And do we think it is fundamentally knowable by individual actors in particular ways? And we can think about, two major ways that sociologists tend to think about this. And again, this sort of tracks typically, see if I can get my pen working here. Yes. Can you see my red writing? Maybe I'll change the pen color. No, the red should be good on this one. In my last class, it was on an old smartboard and you could not see red writing at all. This tends to be typical of quantitative research, whereas number 2 tends to be much more typical of qualitative research. Okay, so the objectivist perspective, right, or an objectivist ontology basically suggests that when we talk about the social world, right, that there is an objective social world that is out there that you can actually measure using quantitative tools typically, right? So that you can put things into numbers. But there is an objective world that you can measure, right? Social phenomenon have an objective reality, right? Independent of our perceptions, right? So that regardless of the subjectivity of the people within a particular social setting, there are objective things that can be measured. And obviously this one's easy, right? That's the objectivist perspective. The constructionist, does that make sense? Okay. A second one, a constructionist perspective, there's kind of 2 forms of it, a hard form and a soft form. The hard form is really, what you might find in someone like Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche, there's no facts, only interpretations. Or if you look at really the hard end of, say, postmodernism, right? A lot of postmodern thinkers, and you can think here, I don't know if you've read any of them, but someone like Jacques Derrida, right? This idea that basically you can't really know anything outside of your own perspective, right? That basically reality is just a set of mental constructions, right? That we can't really, there's no objective reality out there to grasp. And even if there was, we would never be able to do it because we're locked within not only our perspectives, but the perspectives of things like the language we speak, right? English, for all of its many virtues, might actually obscure certain parts of reality. So anyone who is a researcher, who is an English speaker, could never actually really understand reality, if there was an objective reality to measure, because certain aspects of the language they speak and the worldview that comes with it would sort of obscure parts of the world, right? Essentially speaking, there is no God's eye view, right? We can't get outside of the world and look at it from, say, the perspective of metaphorically here, God. And so really all we can talk about is people's interpretations of reality. Okay, so that's the hard one, right? You can't, there's no reality out there for you to access because you're locked inside your meat suit, and you're locked within a social context that's constructed how you can even understand things. So there's no reality out there to access. It's pretty rare that people go this far, right? Because it's kind of unproductive. Philosophers will do it. Literary theorists will do it. Most researchers, won't go quite as far, but will probably end up more in this, this last one, the soft constructivist kind of stance, right? That there is an objective social reality out there that you could, that theoretically is there, but that you're never going to entirely understand it from an objective point of view because of, the same things that you see in the hard perspective, right? You have your own point of view, you have your own subjective experiences, all of the ways that even the actors within a particular social space understand their reality is all their subjective perspective. So all you can really do is, try and understand as many subjective perspectives as possible and hopefully put that into a kind of coherent account of how people are building their reality. But, any kind of idea that there's an objective social reality that you could just go out there and with the right tool sets you can measure it, ultimately is sort of made impossible by the fact that every single person, researcher, and social actors are all locked into their own subjective perspectives. Okay, does that make sense? I saw more nods on other. Yeah, please.
So when you're thinking about soft, it's kind of more like you have different like perspectives you can understand.
Yeah, but you're never like, it's like there might be a social, like an objective reality out there, but we're never going to be able to fully measure it because all we're able to measure is your perspective, your perspective, your perspective, your perspective. So we'll come up with as good an account as we can of the social world, but it's never going to be, a true measurement of the social reality because we're never going to get outside of all of our perspectives. Does that make sense?
I thought that's kind of like hard though. Like, what's the difference between soft and hard?
Well, hard would be there really is no social reality, right? Or there is no objective reality. Everything is just you're constructing it in your mind. And like at the very hard end of it, it would be like there's the entire possibility that you're a brain in a jar, right? And that all that's happening is your jar brain is being, pulsated with electrical impulses that are creating the whole world. And then you have no way of really measuring anything objectively. It's a little fatalistic, which is why most people don't end up there, right? Or what do they call it? A Bozeman brain. You might just be a brain that spontaneously poofed into existence and has dreamed up all of reality. But that's like at the far end of philosophy and not that productive. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Isn't sorry. Sorry. Isn't the objective? I don't really understand the real difference between soft constructionist and objective, the objective perspective. Because isn't the soft constructionist just the objective perspective, but with particularly to the account of human interpretations. Like these two seem really similar to me.
There's some similarities. I think the objectivist would say like there is a social reality and we can measure it, right? Like if we have the right tools, right? Maybe it's surveys, maybe it's, I don't know, whatever your tool set wants to be. We can ultimately measure it regardless of people's subjectivity. The soft constructivist will say, well, there's a social reality, but we can't measure it, right? All we can get is sort of a collection of people's perspectives and hope to put together an account that makes sense, with always the understanding that we're never going to have actually measured reality. We're just going to have measured people's perceptions. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? Nay. Okay. I write on my slides a lot, and I apologize. My doodles and scribbles are not the most useful. Okay. Ontological assumptions, I think, do matter, about reality do matter, because they do shape the way that people ultimately construct their research questions, right? If you think that the world is actually measurable, you're going to construct research questions that are much more kind of aimed at, getting an objective look at what the social world looks like, as opposed to, if you're a constructivist, hard or soft, you're going to be only interested in sort of a general account of people's perceptions of their social spaces, right? And this ends up, I think is my next slide quantitative, qualitative? Yes. This ends up ultimately being, I think, where a lot of the hard split between quantitative and qualitative and social research ultimately kind of, gets set up as this uncrossable kind of barrier, right? We have a lot of quant researchers that don't like qualitative research because they think it's subjective and fluffy, and a lot of qualitative researchers who are critical of quantitative research because they think, you're imagining that you can measure things that actually you're only measuring, social construction of reality, not reality itself. Okay. This was the best joke about qualitative research I could find on the internet. I'm sorry. Bad puns are sort of my brand. Okay, so I've been using these terms a lot. Let's break them down a little bit. And it's really critical, to social research because basically these are the two kind of big branches of social research that we see today, right? And in the department here, we have a lot of both, right? We have quantitative and qualitative researchers, and for the few, the happy, the brave, like me, when I was doing research and not just teaching full time, people who venture into the dark realm of what's called mixed methods, to be mocked cruelly by both sides. Okay, so quantitative research, right? Quantitative research, again, it's right there in the kind of phrasing. We're interested in quantifying the world, right? When we're doing quantitative research, we want to turn essentially everything into numbers, right? We want to be able to categorize things, the social world, in ways that are statistical, right? They're numerical, and they can be statistically kind of studied and analyzed, right? So basically, quantitative research is all about turning the social world into measurable quantities. Now, there's a ton of ways to do this. You're probably familiar, and you kind of run into this every single day in your life, especially if you're a news junkie like me, right? You see some kind of opinion poll, right? The conservatives are ahead, the liberals are behind. This is an attempt at quantifying the social world, right? In terms of politics, right? 39%, I don't know I didn't check the numbers today, but 39% of people say if an election was held today, they would vote conservative, and 20% would vote liberal. And whatever the change is, that's quantification, right? We're trying to say this is the political landscape of Canada today, based on our measurement of the opinions of Canadians, right? An attempt to make political opinions into numbers, right? And again, you see this all the time, right? It's all over the news, and people love numbers because it gives people really solid kind of basis to anchor their thinking in, right? That's quantitative research. Qualitative research does not have anything to do with koalas, sadly. But it is all about, uses mainly words and other non-numeric symbols in collection and data analysis. It's about the quality of people's experiences, right? So what we're really interested with qualitative research is not so much trying to put things into numbers, but understand, through words and through language, people's subjective experiences of the social sphere, right? So you're trying to put that quality of their experiences, whether they're happy, sad, suffering, angry, upset, this is their opinion, right? This is how they see the world, to put that into kind of words to understand their perspective. It's about the quality of those subjects' experiences. Okay. How are you doing with those definitions? Does that make sense? I know you're probably like, this is super basic, please move on. But it's kind of important, because if we don't get these right, everything else is a disaster after this. Okay, so, right, the charts. Oops, that's already open. Okay. Quantitative, right? Mainly deductive, right? Most of the time, quantitative research, you're testing hypotheses, right? You come up with a theory, you have hypotheses about what you'll find, you get data, and then you test the hypotheses to see if you're right. The epistemological orientation is natural science methodologies, or the model of natural science, and positivism, and they're oriented towards objectivism. Qualitative research, again, there can be some slippage here. It's mainly inductive, right? So you're more typically, going from data to theory rather than theory to data, right? It's deductive, you're doing theory to data. Inductive, you're doing data to theory. Generally, you generate a theory out of the data, and it's interpretivist and constructivist in its orientation. Okay, now when we get to the end of the course, right, I have a unit called Mixed Methods, where we sort of will play around with notions of whether these categories are as firewalls, as I guess we sort of paint them in a chart like this, right? Are these differences really irreconcilable? All right, do we have to split research between quantitative and qualitative so starkly? Or, and does real life research kind of cluster neatly into these camps? Now I, as I said a couple seconds ago, am a big advocate of mixed method studies. Mixed methodologies are my absolute favorite. And the best studies that I've ever seen, things like, I don't know, if you've taken SOC of Religion with me, or any of the other classes where I talk about, religion, you'll know that my favorite study in the world is the National Study of Youth and Religion, which came out of University of Notre Dame starting in about 2005. And this is like the, I think, preeminent, for me, mixed method study that I've ever seen, right, where they used surveys, lots of survey data, 3,000 surveys in 4 waves of the study, and then they did, 300 interviews each, and kind of put that together in a way that I think is really, really compelling. So I think, in order to kind of understand the different methodologies, it's useful to split them out and pretend that quantitative research and qualitative research don't touch, right? That they don't like each other. In practice, the best studies you'll see, in sociology certainly, are going to have quantitative and qualitative elements. And, really, whenever I see things that are, I guess, like just before the break, I was reading a paper. What was it about? I think it was about, like, does pornography affect religiosity? And, they ran all these statistics, and they had H1, H2, H3. They tested their 3 hypotheses. And in their conclusion, they said, we really need some qualitative data to figure out whether our the directionality of the correlations from our, because we found correlations in between porn use and declining religiosity, but we would really need some qualitative data to actually get people's experiences and understand what they actually perceive as happening in their own lives. So I think the best studies, to my mind, are always those that have those quantitative and qualitative elements, qualitative elements combined. Because you can learn things from statistics, and then you can learn things from talking to people. And when you put them together, it's kind of magic from a sociological perspective. But when we get to that at the end of the course, we'll talk about mixed methodologies and how you might actually go about putting together a mixed method study. Because there's a million ways to do it, and there's millions of ways that lots of ways these two kind of approaches can fit together for a richer kind of study. Okay. How are you feeling? Good? Questions? All right. No? All right, good. Okay. So what affects, social research? What influences social research? Really, a lot of things, right? So researchers, and this is where, interpretivists will tend to say, you can't have these really, objectivist claims in kind of doing social research, because there's a lot of things that affect, how people do social research, right? So we talked about, epistemology, right? Obviously, what you believe the nature of the world is, right? Ontology and epistemology, and how you can learn about the world. Those are going to affect the kind of social research you do. Politics, the politics of the people doing the research, the politics of the people being researched, the political environment in which the research is done can all affect, what kind of research happens, right? I think you need no clearer an example of the fact that when governments change in Canada, right, the rules at something like the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC, sometimes change. Like when the last Conservative government was in, and one of the mandates that they gave SSHRC was they wanted more practical and business-focused research, to be funded by SSHRC, right? So there's political, concerns and ways that politics can limit what kind of research is ultimately doable at any given moment. I'll talk about practical considerations in a sec. Values, right? The values of the researcher matter, right? What they think is important is going to affect what kind of research they do and what approach they take to it. And especially if you look at, people, I think people who come from that kind of more critical or conflict theory sort of epistemology, they're going to be much more oriented towards, say, throwing down oppression structures and instituting social change, which affects the kind of research that they want to do. And then, theory. So which kind of theoretical background someone comes from is going to affect the kind of research they do, right? A conflict theorist and a functionalist are going to approach research in very different ways, right? If you're looking at social institutions and what they do in society, a functionalist is going to be much more likely to try to look at the ways that it serves society and what its value might be. Whereas, say, a critical theorist is going to be much more likely to be like, okay, in what ways does it create structures of oppression, right? And those things can matter in major ways. And then I think probably the biggest one, practical considerations. You can dream up the most fabulous research project in the world, but not every research project can actually be done, right? Now for this class, and when we come to, your major labs and your mini labs, it's okay to dream big. Like if you're thinking of a research project, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% anchored in reality. But if you ever go on to, say, your master's or your PhD, and you're doing, actual research, there are a lot of practical considerations that you have to worry about. And we'll talk about, and when we talk about, different methodologies, we'll talk about different ways, like, when we talk about ethnography, can you actually, if you want to study people in a particular social environment, can you actually get in there, right? If you wanted to do research on youth gangs in Los Angeles and you wanted to do an ethnography where you go and spend time, A, can you actually make the connections with that group? And B, are you going to get yourself killed trying to do this research, right? These are the kinds of things that you kind of have to think about. Can you get access to the site? Can you get funding for the research? Can you create proper samples in quantitative research? There's all sorts of practical considerations you have to think of. And I'll try, as we go through the course, I tend to give these little kind of, asides or sidebars where I suggest, certain things that work and certain things that don't work in a lot of circumstances, and a lot of it is around the kind of practical considerations around research. I'll give you an example. I had a student write up a lab a few years ago, and one of the things they wanted to do was this interesting question of self-image or body image and social media use. And part of their proposal was, I'm going to go to Twitter and or Instagram, and I'm going to ask Instagram for all of their user data. And I was like, cool idea. That could never happen in reality because Instagram is never going to hand over any of their data because it's proprietary, and they would rather, it's their business secrets, it's their trade secrets. They're not going to hand that stuff over. So when you're constructing it, right, do try, I think, to remain sort of anchored in reality as to what might actually be possible, because there are a lot of ways that even little things that you might not think about now can completely derail research projects. And I've, sadly for me, been around the block enough time to watch grad students founder on the rocks of projects that were simply not doable, right? They are like, I'm going to do this, and then they can't get access. They can't get anyone to talk to them, or they, get into a research site and they mess it up, and then no one will talk to them after that, right? And that happens, right? It's part of the learning process, but there's a ton of practical considerations that have to do with, can you actually do the social research? Okay. So, values. Researchers' values. I was like, do I have a slide for each of these? No, I don't. Okay. Sometimes I get ahead of my slides. Okay. Researchers' values. They obviously can contribute to biasing someone's research, right? So as I said, in the choice of topic, right, the choice of topic that someone makes is going to be affected in large part by their values, right? What do they think is important? What do they want to know? What do they value? Like, if you are, an ardent feminist, right, you're going to be very interested, say, in the experiences of women in society, right? If you are, let's that one's probably a good one, right? If that is who you are and what you think is of paramount importance, right, that's going to affect the kinds of questions that you ultimately ask, right? So it affects the choice of topic. It'll affect the way that you formulate your research question, right? Whatever your values are, whatever you think is really important, right? It's going to shape what kind of research questions you ask and how you ask them, right? Someone, for example, who's much more from a, say, critical theory kind of framework, and has those kinds of values around, throwing down oppressive structures, I think is going to be much more likely to create a research question that, say, is meant to illuminate oppressive structures in society, right? The choice of method, right? How are you going to do your research, right? Someone who, again, like depending on what you're interested in, what you value, what you want your research to do, right? What is it you want your research to do at the end of the day? Are you, I don't know, even like from a basic framework, right? Are you just like an intellectually curious person, right? That you just want to know more about the social world. That's your value. You just want to know about the world, as opposed to, do you want to change the world, right? Do you see structures of oppression that you want to throw down? That's going to possibly change the kind of methodologies that you choose, right? Because, if you value just knowledge, you're going to probably choose, I would say, a quantitative method that just gives you a big overview of the world. And if you're, wanting to talk about creating social change, you might pick more kind of qualitative methods. That's typically the way I've seen it. How you do set up the research design and how you do data collection, right, can all be affected by your values and what you think is important, who you're going to talk to, what you want to talk about, all of these things, the actual data collection, the analysis of the data, and especially I think here, let me underline these two, the interpretation of the data and the conclusions. Both of these things, I think, are really, really affected by values, right? And to say that some people, I think, come to data with preset sort of frameworks and conclusions, I don't think is telling stories out of school, right? There's a lot of this, say, in criminological research, right? Where people, what's his name? It's not Justin Tetro, he's good. He's at Ottawa, and I can't remember his name now. I interviewed him, and I don't remember his name. Anyway, there's a researcher at University of Ottawa, and he is fundamentally a decarceration kind of advocate, right? Which means, like, you think we should close down prisons, right? That prisons are bad, prisons are oppressive, we should close down prisons. And no matter what data he's presented with, everything comes down to my boss, Sandra Buceris, who's fabulous, and he do not get along, so I get to hear about all their like disagreements, we'll say, and where they don't see eye to eye. But, right, everything that he sees always has to be about decarceration. Every bit of data that he interprets comes to the conclusion that prisons are bad and we should close them down, right? And whatever you think of that perspective, right, the values that he comes into the research with ultimately affect his interpretation of the data and the conclusions. All right. So, it's important in doing research, ultimately, to be aware of your own perspectives, right? Are you okay? Okay. Do you need to go get a drink of water? Because it's a lot of coughing. I'm a little concerned. Only because I don't want to get sick. If I get sick, everything falls apart for all of us. Okay. All right, so reflexivity, right? We all need to be aware of what our social positions are, what your values are, and think about how that might affect the way that you ultimately interpret data, right? Ultimately frame your research. Because I think, if you make your personal biases really explicit, and even just think about, as you're constructing your research project, how your own perspective might affect the way that you understand things, I think this is really important. It shows anyone who's reading your research that you've done that hard work to sort of think about your own perspectives, right? I'll tell you a little story about my research, right? Or one of my research projects. I've done a few different ones in a few different kinds of fields. But ultimately, my PhD research project was on Russian TV, right? Which is a fun and cool topic. And basically, I was trying to figure out why certain things were getting made as Russian kind of TV shows as opposed to other ones. And one of the things I kind of had to think through, and my supervisor did a good job of kind of guiding me through, was thinking how my interpretation of Russian TV and everything I saw on Russian TV and in Russia, in the industry, and everyone I talked to was ultimately shaped by the fact that I was Canadian, right? Not Russian. I speak Russian, but I'm not Russian. I didn't grow up there. I don't have the same cultural perspective. I don't have the same cultural framework. I was always looking at, Russian television through the lens of a Westerner, right? Through someone who's Canadian. And so, I have certain conclusions and presuppositions that might affect it. And so, like, if you read my dissertation, which, by the way, don't, it's long and boring, you can. It's probably, as dissertations go, it might be one of the more interesting ones. But I'm pretty explicit, like, look, I'm not Russian. There's definitely things here that I'm missing. And there'll be times, right, when I was looking at a sitcom and I'm like, I know there's a joke here. I just don't get it, right? That this is obviously something that resonates strongly in this cultural setting that I'm missing. And so there's the possibility that my interpretation here is wrong. And I think that kind of reflexivity is really, really important, when we're doing research, because at least if people know what your biases are and you're open about them, they can sort of figure out how much do I trust this person's perspective and how does that interact with my own. All right. Are we doing okay? All right. My throat's getting sore. I'm going to throw one of these in. I'm not sick. I've just been talking for 4 hours today, and it gets a little rough. Okay. So, again, there's different positions on the role of values in research, right? So, if we talk about empiricist and positivist, objectivist kind of perspectives, people think, principally in that camp, typically, that research should be value-free, right? That basically, there shouldn't be any values because the goal is to get as objective a look at the social world as is actually possible, right? So we should try as much as possible to keep our values out of our research so that we don't color the findings with our values. Okay. I don't think generally that's possible, but there's definitely people who have this kind of perspective. The second one, research can't be value-free, right? Because we're all, researchers are people, and people come with a whole bunch of, values, beliefs, norms they bring to the research, and kind of like what I was saying just a second ago, we should be open and explicit about our values, right? And about where we come from, what we believe, so that whoever is encountering our research can make a judgment as to, A, do they trust us? B, are there places where they think the values that we brought to bear on this particular research might have affected our interpretation, right? And so, this is the camp where I kind of fall. I'm like, always, a little bit uncomfortable with activist research for whatever reason. It's never been my kind of cup of tea. And so I'm like, let's just be explicit with what we believe, and then people can make their own decisions from the data about what our biases were. Okay. And then the last one, that researchers should use their values to direct and interpret their investigation. Value commitment is a good thing for researchers to have. And this is more typical, I think, of, I see this kind of approach more in, critical theories, where people are wanting to advocate for types of social change. It's like, this is the values that I come in, and this is what I want to see changed, and this research is oriented towards making that change happen in the world, right? That, I think, is where you tend to see this happening in social research. Okay, politics. I said a little bit about politics. I'll say a little bit more. Researchers sometimes do take sides, right? I was talking about Pichet. It's Justin Pichet. It came to me. Justin Pichet, right, at University of Ottawa. Justin is definitely a person who takes sides in politics, right? And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? Like I said, it's not really my cup of tea, but researchers sometimes take sides in political debates of all sorts. So debates around the role of prison in society, right, is something that someone like Justin Pichet thinks is really, really important to take sides in. So politics can affect you in that way, right? And then the, funding, the political environment, can play a big role as well. Now, I think we tend to see, more of these questions, around funding affecting results, not as much in the social sciences as we do maybe in, say, pharmaceuticals and medicine, right? There's a lot of questions about the way that funding ultimately affects the results that people get, right? So if you're getting funding, right, if you're getting funding to study something, right, are there strings attached? This, for instance, is why if you look at, almost any research paper in a major journal, you'll see at the bottom that they disclose whoever funded the research, right? This research was made possible, this health research on hamburgers, was funded by McDonald's, right? Or something like this, right? Pfizer funded this research, or, that's more in pharmaceuticals. Who was the research body that funded, this particular research project? Say something like the National Study of Youth and Religion, right? They disclosed that they were principally funded by the McGrath Institute. McGrath is a religious research institute, right? They're Roman Catholic. And so, were there strings attached? Researchers will rarely tell you that, yes, we were told to come up with these particular results, and that's why we did. But by disclosing, sources of funding, the idea is you can sort of make an educated guess, right? A lot of health research is like this, right? Is we did this study that found that eggs are good for you, funded by the Canadian Egg Council, right? And stuff like that, right? This kind of stuff happens all the time. Typically, right, government funding tends to be seen as a little bit more, like a little bit less intrusive, right? So in Canada, we have 3 big funding bodies. We have SSHRC, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, NSERC, which is for Natural Sciences and Engineering, and then the health one, which I forget I want to say it's CIHR, Canadian Institute for Health Research. That's CIHR, which funds, medical research and research in nursing and dentistry and pharmacy, right? These tend to be seen as more objective because governments tend to, have less stake. But like I said, sometimes these also, research funding comes with certain kind of explicit or implicit sort of assumptions, like you're funding the kind of research that might be, beneficial to the government, right? Governments might want to fund particular kinds of research that support their political agenda, right? The Harper government probably wanted to fund more research that said lower taxes were better. I can't think of what research the current Liberal government might have funded. But I'm sure there is research that they've funded that suggests, things that are in line with their political agenda as well. And certainly when the Liberals came in, they changed the sort of mandate for things like SSHRC as well. Use my microphone there. Okay. Okay, so other things where, politics can shape things. In order to, research subjects and participants, in what way do the people you want to study potentially shape your research? And I'll put it here, I'll tell you another story. One of the things that when I was doing my research, I had to do and did sort of affect, not in major ways, but in little ways, because I had to cut some quotes that I was going to use from a particular couple of interviews, was that in order to get interviews with a couple of people who had worked on Russian TV, I had to agree to let them basically vet the quotes I was going to use from the interview, right? So, I remember one guy, very particularly great storyteller, British guy, hilarious, and I got some great quotes out of him. But part of the agreement was, hey, I'll sit down and talk with you, but before you write down a word or publish a word of it, I just need to vet all of the quotes, and I get to edit anything I said so that I sound better, essentially, right? Which I did, right? So to get access, right, there were strings attached. And there was a couple of quotes that he said, they were laced with profanity, but he's like, I really don't want this to be my public representation, that he actually cut. And it was kind of unfortunate, but I had to kind of work around it, right? There's lots of other cases, right, where, things might happen where someone might let you into a research setting, but it's like, I want to be able to basically, read your thing before it gets published, and have the right to basically kill it, right? That I can remove anything I said or anything that you observed at our particular research site if that's how I'm feeling about it at the time, right? So sometimes you have to negotiate these kinds of, these are practical considerations as well. In order to get access, there might be strings attached. They might want you to say certain things, present information in a particular way so as not to make them look bad. All of these sorts of things are possible, right? And there could be, that's not my computer dying, is it? Okay, I'm good. All of these things are possible. And yeah, research findings, what things are acceptable to those who funded your research project. And sometimes this isn't so much about the research project that you did, right? Because they've already paid you the funding. But for a lot of researchers, one of the question becomes, right, because it's an ongoing process of publish or perish, how am I going to get that next research grant that allows me to do the next bit of research? And if I, essentially bite the hand that feeds me, will I, at the end of the day, get that next research grant? Or, in some cases, if someone's, say, planning to move into private industry after doing research, would they, write something that's critical of someone who might be a potential employer at the end of the day? These are all things that can affect the way research is reported. Okay. So, related to what you'll be doing in the lab next week. How do you write a research question, right? So there's a lot of, what does a good research question looks like? Okay, what is a good, I gotta slow down. What does a good research question look like? Okay, so a couple things. These might sound obvious, but, academia being what it is, it's probably worth saying. A good research question is generally clear, right? And understandable to other people. This, especially at higher levels, can ultimately become a problem. And what tends to happen, and don't do this, is people will fill their research questions with specific jargon, right? Right, so I don't know, start throwing around particular jargon, or I can't even think of it because I've never been a jargony person. Using the framework of a interpretivist ontology, we plan to already there, right? You've thrown in like five different, a bunch of different jargons. You want to make a research question as clear and comprehensible as possible, right? And the goal is, especially when you're applying for research funding, you're often looking at non-specialist audiences, right? Let's say you're applying to SHRC, right? And you're a criminologist, right? Like half the people in the sociology department now, you're probably a criminologist who wants to become a lawyer eventually, but let's pretend that's not the case. You're a criminologist and you have a bunch of specialized criminology jargon. You want to leave that typically out of your research question. Why? Because people who are evaluating your research question, say at somewhere like SHRC, you might have someone who's a sociologist, but you might actually also have someone who's, from English, right? Someone who's from, a completely different field, psychology, if you can call psychology a real field. Sorry, I gotta throw in my digs at psychology where I can. It's because of my deep-seated problems with Freud, which, if you're in my sociology of youth class, you can get to hear about next class. Okay, it has to be kind of understandable, right? You want layman's terms, people to be able to understand what you're trying to figure out. I think this goes without saying, but we should, is it researchable? And this actually, okay. there are professors in this department who are not good at making sure their grad students have researchable research questions. I had a friend, right? He had done his undergrad here, and then he was moving into his master's while I was doing my PhD. And he came up with, a research question that was brilliant if you had 75 years to research it and it was going to be your entire life's project. It was like, a review of everything that had socially contributed to the emergence of the Anthropocene era. And I'm like, I don't know, okay. Anyway, it was a huge and massive thing. And, what happened to him is he spent 4 years in a master's, produced, I think, at the end of the day, about 10 pages of written work, and then dropped out, having never achieved a degree, right? Which, this was a fundamental failure of his supervisor. That wasn't like, your project is ginormous, pick a smaller, more researchable topic. They're bad supervisors. The one time I can tell you about my bad supervisor who I had to break up with. Not romantically, but as a supervisor. But it felt remarkably similar in some ways. Like, we've been in a relationship for 7 years and I hate you. Bad supervisors exist, that I could tell you some horror stories. Ghosting, is something you can do to your grad students, apparently. Anyway, for 6 to 8 months. Which is fine if you're dating, because the person could just move on. If they're trapped as your grad student, it's less optimal. Anyway, my breakup story with my supervisor notwithstanding, it's less traumatic than my friend's breakup story with her supervisor, where she went to her defense, was told this won't pass, and then had to reconstitute her entire committee, which was super fun and didn't cost her a year of her life. Okay, anyway, grad school is a horror. Your question does have to be researchable, right? It has to be something, and it's going to depend on the kind of, time frame that you're talking about, right? If you're a PhD, a scholar, and you're applying for a 7-year SHRC partnership grant, that's going to make a lot of things possible, right? However, if you are, a grad student and you're going to get, 5 to 6 years to do your PhD project, 4 of those are funded by SHRC, you need to make sure that the research question that you're trying to answer is researchable in that time frame as well. So, you might get comments when you write your research question after the lab next Tuesday with Joe and you submit the mini lab. It might be like, this is a really interesting question. There's no way you could ever do this, right? Like, it's way too broad. Or, this is the project of a lifetime or something like that. Sorry, it should be related in some, my pencil has died. All right. Related in some way to other research. My supervisor, who I broke up with, was not without her charm and wisdom at times, suggested to me when I was like, I found something that no one has ever researched before. And she was like, okay, before you proceed, has no one ever researched it because it's stupid? And this is a valid question to ask, right? Is it related in some way to other research, right? Have other people worked on it, or at least adjacent to it in some way? Because sometimes if you discover something so novel that no one has ever researched it, it might be because you're misunderstanding a concept, right? And you've had some kind of fundamental category error in your thinking, which has led you down, the primrose path of dalliance, to quote a Shakespearean line. And you're going to end up, with nothing because there's nothing there. So yeah, it has to be related in some way to other research. And I mean, any kind of master's or PhD project, the most arduous and taxing part of the project is the dreaded literature review, where you review as much of the literature out there on the same topic as possible. And when I say it's not fun, it's really not fun. But, in order to say something about it, right, you have to connect it to other pieces of research. It's very rare that you're going to come out with something totally original. And like I said, if you do, just be sure that it's not so original because it's dumb. And it was a good piece of advice from a very bad supervisor. And yeah, neither too broad or too narrow, right? Sometimes, too broad, you're going to have too big of a question, too many possible things that might be, contributing to a particular phenomenon you're seeing. So you want to make sure that you could actually kind of, narrow it down, especially say if we're talking about quantitative research, to a couple of variables, right? An independent and a couple of dependent variables, something that you can make kind of claims about how these things are affecting each other. Too narrow, right? Too narrow can be a problem as well, right? If you pick too small a topic, or what is it like? I see lots of these. There's a lot of them that have to do with academic performance. Is like, I'm trying to think. It's like, does people attending study sessions affect their academic performance? In some ways, right, you're going to get 2 data points out of that. Did they attend academic, study sessions, and what was their grade, right? That's going to end up being too narrow for you to make any kind of realistic claims out of, because it's like you're not seeing anything else in their lives that might affect ultimately academic performance. It's like, did they go to a study session and what grade did they get? Right? It's like, okay, well, are they working part-time at the same time? Are they, an international student? There's a million other variables. And so sometimes when you narrow things down too much, especially say if you come up with 2 very what you think are linked variables that cut out the rest of the social world, you can end up creating a research question that's so narrow that you're going to end up missing a lot of things. All right, quick and helpful tip, because I'm, this is my 8th time teaching this class. If you're thinking of writing a research question about academic performance, one measure of academic performance that really sucks, and I'm sorry to tell you this, is GPA. So if you write a question where you're like, how does X affect people's GPA? The problem with GPA is it's a very binary kind of measurement, right? You get one measure, right? So it's like, if you're saying how did something that happened all semester affect someone's GPA? It's almost impossible to know. You'd have to do ongoing evaluation of how things that are happening in their life affect their academic performance, how did they do on their assignments and tests and stuff. We had this disagreement because with my TA last term, not Joe, with Celine, who's a monster. No, I'm kidding. Celine's great. But one of the things was I was like, GPA is a bad measurement because you get it at the end of the semester and it tells you essentially a picture of how you did over a long period of time, but not individually over time, right? So in some ways, I find GPA, when people are asking about GPA, they're asking too narrow a question because it's like you're talking about end performance without seeing what happened over a span of process, right? And so things that are singular, that can't measure process, can be a bit of a problem as well. Okay, that's just because I've seen things, I know what kind of questions you're going to write. Some of you want to write questions about COVID, how COVID affected this. Really hard question to answer because how are you going to quantify COVID, right? How do you operationalize COVID? We'll talk about operationalization later. But just I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying, measuring things like academic performance and COVID are really difficult for a lot of reasons. Okay. Forward. I haven't lost my voice yet, so I feel like I'm doing good. The fisherman's friend is now the professor's friend. Okay. All right. I make such bad jokes and people giggle at them a little bit and I feel a great sense of achievement. Okay. So yeah, formulating a research question. So the choice of your orientation, your design, and your method have to match the question being asked. So a couple of things that you want to think, right? And obviously quantitative and qualitative are going to ask, oh, you have a question. Is that a question?
No.
Okay, you're just leaning against the wall. Yeah. All right, you can see how I might be confused. All good. I'm like, no, did I miss a question? I'm a terrible professor. I should quit my job. Thanks. So, second least awkward comment I've gotten today. I was talking in SOC 100 about the horrors of dating apps and how I'm glad I'm married because I don't have to bother with it. Because I'm, bald, under 6 feet, and I'm a professor, so I don't make that much money. Also, I drive a Dodge Grand Caravan because I have 3 kids. And one of the comments on the slide was like, well, I'd swipe right. And I'm like, awkward comment in class. So that's only the second worst comment today. That's okay. The first class of SOS 100, someone put up there, I think I might love you. And I'm like, That was easy. All right, cool. Then my question is always, if you like me this much, who hurt you in the past? And then it gets awkward. We go into psychoanalysis. We start doing a Freudian thing, and then I have to hate myself. Okay, so I'm back to my topic. Sorry, towards the end of class, I probably get a little punchy because it's a long day. The choice of research, right? So, is it a brand new phenomenon that you're observing? Typically, brand new phenomena in social research are really, really exceedingly rare, right? So, if you think you've discovered a brand new phenomenon, question yourself deeply, because you may be observing something. You might be making an error in judgment as to whether this is even a phenomenon or whether it's new, because almost everything in the social world has been experienced at least once before. Okay, so is it a brand new phenomenon? I guess the other thing that you want to make sure, and this can be a problem on the other end, is it interesting, right? And maybe is it a brand new phenomenon is one way of thinking about it. The other one, and again, I should credit my terrible supervisor who I hate. I've never seen her since I broke up with her, but if I ever do, I have a list of things I want to tell her. She always would ask, this question, and it aggravated me to no end, but it's a good question. So what? Right? Okay, this is what you're going to study. Why is it important? Right? Why does it matter? Right? And there's a certain thing, especially in social research, if it's just a matter of pure intellectual curiosity, that can be kind of interesting, but it's not always compelling, right? So if you're looking for funding, if you're trying to convince a publisher to publish your book or get an article published in a journal, the so what kind of matters, right? Is the thing you're studying actually important, right? Or is it just, a passing curiosity that you're kind of vaguely intellectually interested in, but doesn't actually matter at the end of the day? And trust me, there is a lot of this in academia where, if someone had bothered to say, okay, well, you discovered this, so what? The people honestly can't answer, because there is no so what. It's just an exercise in academic research for its own sake. Measuring impact, right? Is the question that you're asking actually going to see the impact of a particular social phenomenon in the world, right? Is there again, this is kind of the so what factor. Why is it important? What's the impact of it? Why should anyone care about this particular thing? Okay, and then worldview, is it, what's the worldview you're coming at it with? Are you trying to validate a worldview? And are you testing a hypothesis, right? Do you have a hypothesis as to what is going on? Or are you going to do something more like grounded theory, where you're going to go get data, right? Is your research question to test a hypothesis, or are you getting data to create a hypothesis, right? Are you trying to look at a phenomenon just because you then need to figure out what is going on and come up with a theory from there, right? And these are useful kind of questions to ask yourself. Okay. I'm sorry to tell you that it is at this point that I will probably start making a ton of jokes and references to furry culture, because for whatever reason, the first time I taught this class, I cued in on furries as a particularly useful and illustrative example, and I've never been able to let it go. And so, I felt so bad. His name was Evan, and last semester, every time I talked about furries, he would just shake his head in disdain, and I started to kind of make a game out of it. So I'm sorry. Okay, right. So a research question. It states the purpose of the study in the form of a question, right? Okay. And again, quantitative and qualitative questions are going to look a little bit different. And I can show you kind of in very basic terms in these example questions why that is, right? So, what social factors make people enjoy smoking marijuana? Okay, what do you think? Is this a quantitative or a qualitative research question? Yeah.
Qualitative?
It's actually quantitative, right? Because what you're trying, it's a good guess though, and I've given you no background to do this, so it's an unfair question. Because you're trying to say, how does independent variable, right, social factors, ultimately affect, the likelihood or the enjoyment people have from smoking marijuana? So you're trying to measure two things, right? So if, let's say a person is, I don't know, what is their race, socioeconomic status, level of education, religious affiliation, how would that affect, whether they enjoy smoking marijuana or not, right? Okay. So it's measurable, right? You could measure all of these things. If a person fits this category, how would it affect this? All right, second one. What explains differential suicide rates in society? What do you think? Quantitative or qualitative? Now no one wants to guess because I was mean to him. No, I wasn't mean. Or maybe I wasn't. Yeah, please. It is, yeah, you're right. It's quantitative, right? Because you're going to say, okay, what, in this case, you're not explicitly stating social factors, but that's what you're going to be measuring, right? Is if someone is, this is kind of Durkheim's question, right, from the suicide study, or on suicide, right? Is it like, if you're Jewish, does that affect whether you're more likely to kill yourself, or Catholic, or whatever, right? Rich, poor, all of these sorts of things. If you have, a mental illness, what does that look like? All right, the third one. What is it like to be a member of furry fandom? Yeah, please. That is qualitative. You're right. Right, because you're asking about, people's experiences. Like, what is it like, or what is the experience of people who are in a particular group, right? What is it like to be a Hell's Angel? What is it like to, participate in dating culture or be on a dating app in 2024? I almost said 2022. I almost went back in time 2 years. All of these are about people's experiences, right, of particular aspects of the social world, right? So all of these things, right, they imply probably at least an orientation in terms of the kind of research it's going to be. So you might get this from me. Almost inevitably what happens is when we get to the second part of the course, and I've been training you for half the course to ask quantitative questions, I then ask you to write a qualitative question and you give me a quantitative question. But quantitative questions almost always end up with, how does, X, which is your independent variable, affect, I don't have let's say an arrow, affect Y, right? Or an X can be not just a single variable, but a cluster of variables, right? Like social factors, these can be demographic factors, and these sorts of things. They almost always have this, how does one affect the other, right? That's the most typical phrasing of a quantitative question, right? How does pornography consumption affect religiosity, right? How does, wealth affect level of education amongst immigrants, right? All of these, or amongst, the children of immigrants, all of these sorts of things, right? It's always this, like, again, in very kind of scientific terms, independent variable. And I love this because, I'm not this way, but Phil Boati, who's one of the newer professors in the department, he's absolutely a quant guy, and he like shorthands this. So he's like, how does the ID or IV affect the DV, right? The independent variable, dependent variable. I'm like, is it actually that much work to say independent and dependent variable? But apparently, once you do it enough, you're always in like super shorthand. So yeah, independent variable, right? So always be thinking in the phrasing of quantitative questions. My pen is flaking out on me. It probably needs a new battery. Independent variable, how does it affect, dependent variable or variables, right? I know that looks terrible. I'm really sorry. When you're talking about qualitative research questions, right, you have a much bigger focus on experience, right? So what is the experience of people? What is it like to be? And all of these sorts of things. Okay. I feel like at 3:15, do you want to keep going? I can do one more slide, or are you done? It's up to you.
Do it.
Do it? All right, let's do it. Okay. I'll fuel up on peppermint tea and we're good to go. Okay, so the form of research, the form of the research question is shaped by whether it's quantitative or qualitative. That's essentially what I was talking about, right? Qualitative tends to be a little bit less specific. It's going to, generally be oriented towards an inductive process, right? So again, inductive is you start with data gathering and you're going to generate a theory or hypothesis after that. So generally, your research question will not include a hypothesis, right? Now, again, at the level we're at for this class, I might ask you to kind of take in your research proposal, take a guess at what you might find outside of the research question. But it's really, really common, right, in formulating, a kind of research question quantitatively, that you're going to have some kind of hypothesis kind of built into the research question in a lot of ways. Now, again, we don't have to do it for this class, and right, like the form that I have here, right, so how social factors influence how people enjoy smoking marijuana. Most people will have a hypothesis going in, right? So that, whatever it is, being less religious will tend to be associated with higher uses of marijuana in this case. But quantitative questions, right, are typically a little bit more specific, right? Because you're orienting it towards a hypothesis or towards something you're wanting to test. It's generally kind of set up for a deductive process, right? Where it's going to, you're going to have this idea of what you're going to find, right? It's like, your hypothesis being, that, say, in this case of the paper I read before Christmas, pornography use leads to lower religiosity in young people, right? Your research question is kind of oriented towards, that sort of focus, right? And then it's like, we're going to use the data we collect to then test the hypothesis, right? So you have your hypothesis, you gather the data, and then you test the hypothesis, to see whether that hypothesis holds up at the end of the day. All right, that was my last slide for today. Okay, I will discard my doodles and we'll pick up with the next topic on Monday, because this class is offered twice a week. So we'll see you again on Monday. Have a great weekend, which feels always weird to say on Wednesday, but we'll see you on Monday. And if you have any questions, do let me know. I started putting the recordings up on eClass, so if you want to go back and review anything, please feel